Welcome to the Talk BD podcast, where we break down the science and strategies to live well with bipolar disorder.
Hi, everybody. Erin Michalak here, leader and founder of the collaborative research team to study psychosocial issues in bipolar disorder, or CREST-BD. I'm joining you at the end of a beautiful spring day on the west side of Canada, traditional, unceded, and ancestral and beautiful lands of the Coast Salish people. It's my pleasure to be joining you for this Talk BD event focused on disclosure. It's been an incredibly busy week for us at the CREST-BD offices. Last Thursday was World Bipolar Day. We held our 5th annual CREST-BD Ask Me Anything on the Reddit platform. It was a very active event. At this point in time, I think there have been edging up to 900,000 views on the conversation we had. And as with every World Bipolar Day event we've held in the past, the topic of disclosure came up again and again. Now, this is something we've talked about at a high level in past Talk BD episodes, but we've already heard from community that you would like to hear more about pragmatic strategies to help you as much as possible, if you do choose to disclose your diagnosis of bipolar disorder, to stay in the driver's seat of that process. And that's what we'll be doing today with our two amazing panelists. First of all, it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Brad Bitterly. Brad, it's very early where you are in Hong Kong. Are you a lark or an owl by nature?
Depends on the situation. Today I'm a lark. So, and it's 9:00. It's not that bad. I can't really complain.
Thanks for joining us. Why don't you introduce yourself to everybody at the event?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Erin, for the great introduction. So I'm Brad Bitterly. I'm an assistant professor of management at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. My research focuses on communication during strategic disclosure interactions, like interviews and negotiations. So I'll be discussing part of my research today because a large part of it focuses on when we're in situations we don't want to reveal costly information, how do we handle those situations? So I look forward to chatting about this with everyone, and thank you so much for having me.
Thanks, Brad. Academia is a busy life, just like everybody with busy lives. What do you do in your downtime when you're switching off from your computer or your research life?
So I have started to surf. I mean, whether or not other observers think I actually surf is a matter of debate, but I have started to try to, and which is nice having grown up in rural Pennsylvania. It's nice to be able to do that here.
Dr. Lisa O'Donnell, what are you doing in your spare time outside of your academic life?
Well, I'm actually having the fun experience of being in Vancouver as well for the semester. It's been a wonderful experience. And so I've been taking advantage of it with outdoors activities, especially with my 2 little French bulldogs going for walks around the beach and hiking. So that's sort of been a lot of my downtime lately.
And then when you're not playing with Frenchies, how's your work life looking?
That's all I do is play with them. They're very demanding. So I'm a assistant professor at Wayne State University in the School of Social Work, which is located in Detroit, Michigan, in the United States. And I have been a clinician for many years, working with people with bipolar disorder, teaching clinical courses, and also research related to employment, disclosure, and stigma related to bipolar disorder.
Perfect fit for today's talk. So you're going to launch us off, Lisa, is that right?
Yes, I am. Happy to do that. Thank you. So I just want to say again, thank you for inviting us to join this podcast. I think I can speak for Brad and myself that this is a topic we're both very passionate about and are excited to be here. So I just want to give a little background on why are we doing this podcast? So choosing to disclose a diagnosis of bipolar disorder is a very important topic, which Erin mentioned comes up quite a bit because it's a difficult decision for many people. The bottom line is that stigma still exists. What's interesting is we're seeing a reduction in stigma towards other conditions such as depression. Unfortunately, this isn't so much the case with bipolar disorder. So it makes the decision to disclose quite difficult, and it also becomes a dilemma. On one hand, when people disclose, they can, receive support and appropriate work accommodations, which tends to support better work success. On the other hand, discrimination is a reality. So we know that people living with bipolar disorder report that they have experienced discrimination, negative experience in the workplace and other in school and other areas following disclosure, such as being treated unfairly and even illegally. So the good news is that research also supports that when people are more educated on the topic of bipolar disorder, and especially if they just personally know somebody with a condition, that this can change negative stereotypes, increase compassion, and also increase understanding. So our goal today is not to direct anybody one way or the other on whether to disclose. It's obviously a very personal decision and entirely up to the individual. But disclosing can be really scary and complicated, and also can feel like you're relinquishing control of really personal information. So our goal today is to provide pragmatic approaches to making the decision to disclose, and to help people stay in the driver's seat if they do so. And Brad, I will pass it on to you.
All right. Thank you, Lisa. Disclosure can actually carry a lot of potential risks, especially given that bipolar is a highly stigmatized condition. On the flip side, there's also a lot of benefits that we know that can happen from disclosure. So it's important to highlight those so that way people can make an informed decision for themselves. So overall, the way the research conceptualizes disclosure is revealing potentially costly information to another person. So in the case of bipolar disorder, it could be disclosing that you have the disorder or additional information such as the symptoms. We know from research and psychology, psychiatry, behavioral economics, there's a lot of benefits to disclosure, both psychologically and interpersonally. So psychologically, going around feeling like you're living a double life, feeling like you're not actually being your true authentic self, that can carry a big burden in two main ways. It can be cognitively demanding, trying to navigate living a separate life externally than you feel like you're actually living internally. And then emotionally, it can be really draining because it can actually be very stress and anxiety provoking. So there can be a feeling of empowerment to disclosing and feeling like you're living your external life consistent with your internal life and that you're actually being your true authentic self. Now, the important caveat to that is provided that it's well received and you don't actually face a lot of significant backlash from it. Now, interpersonally, there can be a lot of benefits to it. And the reason for this is that actually disclosure is a key way by which actually humans develop their relationships. This is true both in private relationships, such as like dating and finding your significant other. It's also true in professional relationships, such as negotiations, like trying to find the right solution. And the reason that it helps a lot is that when you disclose potentially costly information to me, you're signaling to me that you really trust me and you're taking the first step to developing our relationship. And frequently people feel the need to want to actually reciprocate that trust and often even actually disclose costly information in return. And by actually being vulnerable to each other, we're actually helping to build trust and show, okay, we have a good bond and we're part of the same in-group. So it can be really useful for building both professional and personal relationships. So for example, in negotiations, it helps people develop that trust to find more creative solutions. But again, like it's important to take into account that's when it goes well. And as we all know, it doesn't always go well. And sometimes people can potentially take advantage of the information that you actually disclosed or exploit you because of it. And then finally, the other area where it can actually be very beneficial is if you need or would really benefit from having from accommodations or legal protection in the workplace, depending on where you live, if the place that you actually live has those protections, you can receive the benefit from that as well. But the key thing to highlight with all of this is that disclosure is a very high reward, but also high risk behavior. And because of that, the only person that's going to be able to make the decision for it is ultimately going to be yourself, because you'll know better than anyone else what the potential benefits are and what the potential risks are. So there's no one size fits all solution. And you're going to want to actually assess both professional and personal life. What's the best strategy in your personal life you might be more willing to disclose than professional life? And then also, there's not just one universal approach, even in your professional life. There might be some colleagues that you disclose to and other ones that you don't. But ultimately, it's an individual decision, and it's important for each person to weigh both the benefits and the costs. And I'll let Lisa talk more about how to go about doing that process.
Thank you. Perfect transition. Because what I want to do now is share a few strategies that can help in determining whether to disclose, and questions to consider, when you're making the decision. So first, as Brad said, is basically weighing the pros and the cons. So this is a great evidence-based strategy to help with decision-making. And I just want to point out that we're going to be providing resources, and there will be a worksheet that you can work through that provides specific examples of going through. Because what you're doing with this is you're basically examining what are the advantages and disadvantages in disclosing for your particular situation. So for example, a con, you might put that you can ask for work accommodations and you might get support at work. So those are two pros, not cons. On the other hand, a con to disclosing at work is your condition could be shared with others at work without consent. So what you do is you can systematically work through the different pros and cons and then weigh them. And that can help make a decision of whether it seems the right decision at that time based on what you came up with. One suggestion I do have is, although this decision is ultimately up to the individual making it, it doesn't mean you have to do it alone. And so you can work through this process with a friend or even a professional who specializes in bipolar disorder, who might have further insights that you can add into this process. Another benefit of doing this is that when you start identifying some of the cons, it might actually help you anticipate if you do decide to disclose some of the cons and problem solve them to sort of prevent them from happening or just to prepare for them. So that's one strategy. Next, I just want to share some key questions to consider before disclosing. Brad kind of addressed a little bit of this. I just want to get into a bit more detail. Again, there is a worksheet, a resource that provides these specific questions and more. I'm just going to highlight a few. So this can help in determining a number of things in terms of how you disclose. So the first question is, who will I tell? And obviously, if you're disclosing to a partner in a romantic relationship, you know the answer to that. However, if you're thinking about a different context, such as work or school, it can be really useful to consider certain things about the person you want to disclose to, such as, do I know them to be trustworthy? Will they keep this confidential? Do they seem to share, other people's information? And do others confide in them? And also, really importantly, have they talked about mental health conditions? Have they talked about disabilities? Do they seem informed? Do they seem to discuss it in a respectful way? So those kind of questions can give you information to help you figure out, is this the right person for me to disclose to? Secondly, why will I tell them? And there could be a number of reasons. It's not necessarily just one, but a lot of people do it for emotional support. You might share it with a partner, friends, family, or even a coworker. It may be to request work or school accommodations. And a lot of times people find disclosing destigmatizing and empowering. It can increase their own acceptance of the illness. So there are a number of reasons why people disclose, and determining what those are can also help you with the process. So a few other questions I'll quickly go over that's really important that Brad mentioned is, am I protected legally in my workplace or in my school environment if I disclose? And it's highly likely you are, but it can be very helpful to know your exact rights in the country that you live in. And generally what you can do is you can find this information on a government website. So for example, I'm from the United States, and you can go to the Department of Labor, and they will have the exact rights of different types of disabilities laid out. And that can be really useful. Like I said, generally people are covered, but sometimes the size of the company, the particular type of job, there might be some differences in terms of rights related to those. And it's always helpful to think through before disclosing what are the specific accommodations. Again, if you're disclosing in a work and a school environment, or even if you're disclosing in a personal situation, am I going to ask something from the person I'm sharing? So are specific work accommodations going to be best for me? Am I looking for a particular type of support from them? And then lastly, along the same lines, is there a trusted, as I said, this can be a very isolated experience and it's also a scary one. So is there a trusted person who can support me during this process in terms of thinking about it, talking it through, practicing, being there for you, when you're disclosing, not in the actual situation necessarily, but just being a support for you during it and following as well. And this could be a therapist, a friend, family member, even a support group. And Brad, back to you.
Thank you, Lisa. When you're thinking about disclosing, a general good strategy for life is hope for the best, prepare for the worst. So it's useful to think through and know what you're going to actually do in the event actually the person doesn't respond the way that you were hoping that they're going to respond. So recognize, okay, well, if you feel rejected, that could actually be a very emotional event. So what's your usual path for actually managing your mood in that situation? Make sure you have those steps figured out. Many of you probably do already, but just planning in advance, okay, what am I going to do if this actually doesn't go as well as I'm hoping it will go? And then even if it's a professional context, being aware of, as Lisa was mentioning before, like what legal protections you might take. Do you know someone you could actually consult if potentially it does go the legal route and you actually will need that protection? Being aware of that and having that in advance, you'll have it in your back pocket in case you actually need it, which hopefully you won't, but in the event that you do, you'll be prepared. And then another key aspect of this is that being prepared for what if you're actually asked a follow-up question, or even if you're actually asked questions like that you don't want to answer, or what if it's a situation where you actually don't want to disclose? And that's where knowing how to handle that is important. And fortunately, there is a lot of research that's been conducted. This is an area where I've conducted research and other people have actually looked at what are strategies we can use to avoid disclosing costly information. Because sometimes, like honesty, we know or we suspect that we can't actually be honest. So what should we do instead? Well, in these situations, a frequent go-to strategy people want to use is explicitly declining to disclose and saying, I don't want to answer that question. The reason why that strategy generally isn't good interpersonally is that we infer people's motives and make judgments of them based off of those inferred motives. And if we think people are being forthcoming, we view them as very trustworthy and likable. If we think that they're hiding information, we don't view them as trustworthy and likable. And saying, I don't want to answer your questions, you're essentially, rather than helping to build that social bond, you're telling the person, I don't view you as a trustworthy person. I'm not going to tell you. So that's when people can actually, where it can be very useful to use one of the more deceptive strategies. And we frequently actually view deception as wrong. We're told growing up, oh, you should never lie. But that's just bad general advice because everyone does. In fact, we're actually programmed to do it. If children don't start lying by the age of 4, it's actually a warning sign that they don't have theory of mind, which means that they know someone else has different thoughts than them and they can actually shape them. So it's just a fundamental part of human behavior. And there's a few different tactics you can actually use when it comes to disclosure. So the one that everyone's familiar with is a lie of commission. Flat out lying is very effective, but it's also very risky because if someone discovers that you had lied to them, obviously we don't like that person. We don't trust them. So, and then also it can be psychologically very difficult because we don't like thinking of ourselves as liars. And so we don't like using that strategy. So if you don't feel comfortable actually using a lie, or the other additional risk is you could potentially face legal risk as well in some context if you're actually caught lying. People will instead turn to one of the other strategies, such as paltering. And a summary of these strategies will be posted online so people can see them. So the summary of it will be available later. So paltering is where you use truthful statements intended to mislead. So an example of this is So I actually have lived experience. If I'm out for drinks with people and I don't know them well, and they ask me, why aren't you drinking? I just tell them I have migraines. It's true, but I'm also leaving out the underlying cause for the migraines. Paltering can be a very effective strategy because we feel more comfortable delivering it because we're using truthful statements. Our counterpart, though, if they actually discovered that we had omitted information, can still view us as a liar. So you can still face some interpersonal costs if they discover the true underlying information. So an alternative strategy is dodging. And you've all witnessed it if you watch politicians. Politicians love using dodging. Why do they love doing it? It's because it's tremendously effective. So that's where you give a very eloquent response to a closely related question, but not the question that was asked. So if someone asks like, do you have bipolar disorder? You can say, oh, actually, I'm happy you asked that. I was thinking about the company support for mental health. And we probably need to get more engaged in initiatives for neurodiversity. I'm in the process of reaching out to HR and I'm hoping to hear back from them soon. And I'll be sure to keep you posted based off of what I hear. Dodging is really useful because if you give an eloquent response, people think that you're competent. It's also not certain to them why you didn't answer the original question that was asked. And it makes it unclear. And people might just think, okay, Brad misunderstood the question that was asked. So as a result, he answered a related one. But okay, he wasn't actually trying to actually deceive me. And as a result, it tends not to be as costly as lying or paltering if people discover the true underlying information. Dodging can be even more effective when coupled with the following strategy, which can also be used on its own, which is deflection. And that's when you use questions to redirect the conversation back to the question asker. So for example, if I use the last dodge and say, oh, well, actually, I'm waiting to hear back from HR about our initiatives for neurodiversity, you can follow up and say, do you know who I should actually reach out to? Like, who's a good point contact? I'm responding with a question. I'm shifting the conversation back to the question asker. And in doing so, I'm both violating this conversational norm, you're supposed to respond to questions, and also invoking it and making my counterpart feel compelled that they have to answer my question. And when I've run experiments testing this, I find that in 75% of the cases, where someone's even financially incentivized to get the true information, they just respond to the question and move on with the conversation. So it's a very powerful tactic. And it's also beneficial because if people discover the true information, say that you have bipolar disorder or whatever it is, they infer that you were trying to seek more information and learn more information rather than that you were trying to hide information. And then finally, an additional tactic that can be really helpful in these situations is humor. So actually, by using humor and disclosing information in a way that you're joking about it, you're demonstrating that you're very confident about the underlying issue, that it's not actually a concern. You're making the other person laugh, which makes them like you more. Humor is very cognitively distracting. It pulls our attention away from negative information. And they also infer that you're just trying to entertain them rather than trying to seriously convey information. So a very famous example of someone using this to hide an underlying mental health issue was when Ronald Reagan was running for re-election. There were concerns about his mental health. He was going to be the oldest president to be elected at the time. And during the first debate, he showed signs of being lost, which now in hindsight, we know was because of early stage Alzheimer's. But during the second debate, when he was asked, oh, do you have concerns about your age? He said, I'm not going to make age an issue in this election. I'm not going to hold my opponent's youth and inexperience against him. And the entire crowd burst out laughing, including Mondale, his opponent. Mondale said that's when he knew he was going to lose the election, and no one returned to the issue. Like, this was a major issue. We're talking about one of the most public interviews possible, a very serious health issue, and he was able to completely get people to forget about it and move on by using humor. So humor is extremely important. The key thing with all of this is, a summary of the strategies will be available. Think through what strategy you feel the most comfortable with using. It's going to vary depending on who you are, depending on who you'll be interacting with. and then just think about it and practice them, because getting more familiar with them and more confident and comfortable with delivering them will help you to, when you're in those situations, where someone might ask a question you don't feel completely comfortable answering. So that way you can actually avoid disclosing in that situation.
I was going to ask if you could practice some of those in advance. You can't really practice being funny, though, can you? That one's a little bit more off the cusp, or can you?
I think you can, because the key thing about Reagan was he would prepare his jokes in advance. So that one wasn't off the cuff. He knew the question was coming. He knew there were concerns about his mental health. So he had prepped the jokes in advance, and he also had a lot of experience delivering humor from being an actor. So it also absolutely practice can help with each of these strategies. I don't think any of us are born dodging like a politician, but they all learn to do it. So absolutely all these tactics can be effective. They can require some practice, and that's where practicing with a family member or friend, I think, can be extremely effective.
Wonderful array of strategies laid out by Brad, Lisa, covering, lying and being outright defensive, probably not the best strategy a lot of the time, haltering, dodging, deflection. And as mentioned, we will have resources getting into more depth of these at the end of this event. Did you have any reflections on that, Lisa, or would you like to sort of carry on to questions and answers?
Well, first, I don't know if you probably noticed, I disappeared. I apologize.
I was trying to dodge the fact that you disappeared momentarily. Now that everybody's listening on the podcast and couldn't actually see you disappear, are going to be amazed with your sense of humor and grace, having had the ultimate gremlin.
I was just saying, I think we should rename this podcast "The Benefits of Lying." I think it would get quite a bit of interest. But no, that was so interesting, Brad. But I'm ready to move on to the questions.
Okay, and they've been coming in thick and fast. So thank you to everybody engaging on the line, and wonderful to see so many people from different geographies joining us. This one is I'm going to start with is actually about bipolar disorder specifically, and the person asking the question says that, and this is true, there is no condition that's as complicated or as diverse or as varied as bipolar disorder. People will or can experience episodes of depression through to what we call euthymia, which is feeling perfectly fine, through to hypomania, sometimes mania, sometimes psychosis, sometimes functioning so well in the workplace that you're doing much better, frankly, than your peers and colleagues. Other times, not so much. And this person's question is around how, disclosing a condition like this is not straightforward. It's not like saying I experienced depression that a lot of people can empathize with. So there isn't a lot of room a lot of the time to share the nuance of the condition or the opportunity to say, this is what mania or hypomania looks like for me. Brad, do you have any suggestions for how you could sort of navigate the complexities of bipolar disorder specifically in terms of what you're communicating? Or should you?
I think it's an excellent question. I don't have one absolute true strategy. I think depending on the counterpart, depending on how much you want to disclose to them, disclosing some of the symptoms, but without actually disclosing the overall condition, that might actually help them to understand part of it. Or as far as it's, for example, saying, look, like sometimes I'm very productive, sometimes I'm actually not very productive. That part, framing it that way might not be as intimidating to someone else than using the term, because the term itself might really could potentially cause someone to get more worried, just because it is a stigmatized term that people don't fully understand. So, but that will vary based off of the situation and depending on how much you want to reveal. As far as disclosing mania, it is challenging because it's so complicated, and I feel like part of the difficulty we have is we don't. Even if people can't fully relate to depression, we still have a common language have a common language to describe the symptoms of it. There's songs, there's music. And then even as far as, because it's seen as more normative, even as far as the attributions. So it's, oh, I'm really sad. Why are you sad? Well, you know what? Actually, I just had an argument with my significant other. Even if that's not actually the real cause, we know narratives to actually, and ways to describe it in ways that are actually very socially acceptable, or are perceived as normative and socially acceptable. I don't think we have that as much for mania, which does make it actually more difficult. Because it's kind of like, oh, well, why were you manic? Jet lag. Why? I don't know what to tell you. So I think I relate to that issue. I don't know the best strategy though overall to how to communicate it. Lisa, do you have suggestions to this?
It is a really good and complicated question, right? I had a few thoughts to add on to that. First of all, again, you're not the spokesperson for your condition. You're not obligated to share and make sure the person is perfectly educated on what it looks like to live with bipolar disorder or another condition. There are resources online, right, to learn about a lot of this. For me, my thought is, how again, why are you sharing this? How is it likely going to maybe present itself to the person you're sharing it with in the environment? What would be useful for them to know? You don't even have to say the actual condition. Like Brad was saying, you can say, oh, sometimes I have, due to my condition, you can be vague about it. I have higher productivity times and lower, and I'm, can communicate that or whatever it is you're trying to say. But I would just say that, again, it's very personal what you're comfortable sharing. And it doesn't have to be a one-time event, that you might share a little bit in the beginning. And then as you develop a relationship and trust with the person and they might ask you questions, you might end up sharing more over time. So it's not as if it's all at once, you have to share everything. So you don't have to make the decision immediately in terms of how much to share.
I'm interested that you both brought up the opportunity of talking about productivity in the workplace. I remember when we were doing interviews with people around disclosure of bipolar disorder in a study some years ago, one woman was experiencing quite a significant stigma from a manager. And the way that they worked it out, she disclosed to this manager, was through a productivity lens. And she made the argument that, listen, my productivity overall in my workplace is higher than the average employee. I know that you don't see it like that right now, but maybe together we can track that. And that was the route that they came to peace between them in terms of her positioning in the workplace, was they tracked her productivity over the time. And yeah, it was markedly higher over time as opposed to, when taking into account the ups and downs of the condition.
That is such an excellent point and something to consider if you are requesting accommodations for work and school, because I teach and my students receive points for participation, for example. And at work even, sometimes people, might be more engaged at work than other times, and the productivity is a big part of it too. I think I love the idea of like having a conversation about, can I get a review? Can we look at my overall work productivity and performance over time versus snapshots when it's going to vary?
I really like the idea of trying to draw people to objective information, such as the objective performance, because we know our brains are very skewed and we tend more to negative information. And we remember that actually it's more vivid, remember it more, we remember it strong with like higher intensity than we remember positive information. And as a result, like that can completely skew someone's perception of, say, your performance, because they're going to remember more of the times where you weren't productive than the times you were. And it's going to cause a very biased perspective, even if they're not intending to do it. Like from an evolutionary perspective, we're just wired to tend to threats more than we are to actually celebrate good things. So if you can pull it more towards actually, look, this is my objective performance, I'm actually doing really well, I think that's a good strategy.
And I assume the same thing happens for us subjectively as well, Brad, that those failures or negative experiences are much harder to forget, are more top of mind than the times that we were successful.
Yeah, it's like, and behavioral economics, they estimate that negative events are weighed twice as strongly as positive events. We just really, we focus on the negative rather than the positive. And the thought is, if we just focus on positive events, that wouldn't be evolutionarily adaptive, because then we would just celebrate our successes and then just stop actually pushing ourselves to progress forward. If we get enjoyment out of positive events, but then don't celebrate too much and focus more on actually avoiding those negative events, that makes us more adaptive and actually helps to ensure that we avoid negative events and actually prevent bad things. So, but it because of that, yeah, you can stew and be stuck really remembering negative things you've done more than you've done positive things, and that can be really difficult to escape.
Makes sense. It's like when I went over there a long time ago, I got chased by a saber-toothed tiger. When I went over there, I had a lovely time. Which one are you more likely to remember?
We've had a lot of
yeah.
Go on, Brad. Did you have something else to say, or are you ready for another question?
No, it was just going to say exactly, yeah. And then if the saber-toothed tiger isn't vivid, there probably were some of us that were like that millions of years ago, but the people that did view it very negatively are the ones that stuck around and we descended from.
We've had a bunch of questions come through essentially about discrimination, which, as Lisa said at the beginning, is a reality. We can, have as many work jobs, sort of, safety nets and legal supports for people facing mental health challenges as we want, but people will still be treated unfairly, inequitably, and discriminated against. So let's get into a few of those. This person is actually talking about her son who had to go to a physical as part of a job hire. He listed his medications and wasn't offered the job. Was it the right thing, to be honest, in that situation? It's a tough one.
That is a tough one. I'm going to be honest. I'm not sure. In that circumstance, I guess what the benefits of sharing, I'm not sure what they would be. I guess it would depend on the type of work it is. If it affects your insurance, health coverage, anything like that. I'm not clear what the actual benefits, but in some cases, I might encourage not sharing that, honestly, if it's going to prevent you from getting the job. But I don't know if that's the bad lying or the good lying, so I'll let Brad respond to that too.
I think it will really depend on the particular position. But I mean, I haven't been in an interview where they requested that information, and I haven't been required to actually disclose it. And I haven't voluntarily provided it just because it's if it's not going to impact my performance, I view it as they don't need to know it. So if in that case, it's called a lie of omission, you're leaving out information. Like, we do that all the time. Everyone does it. Nobody's perfect. So in that case, I mean, I don't want to say always, because there could be some positions where it is necessary to disclose that information. And I'm not, so you might be legally required to disclose it, but if it's not going to impact your performance and you're not required to disclose it, I think it's perfectly okay to, it's your own private information, and it's up to you if you want to disclose it in that situation.
So I'm hearing something similar from both of you, with the caveats that there will be certain professions that legally mandate disclosure. Every year on our Reddit, Ask Me Anything, we get questions coming in from airline employees. There's, I think, one example of that. So I know that there are some where there are different sort of legal parameters around that, but it sounds like sort of judicious disclosure in those situations for many other people is an option. You want to talk about romantic relationships? When's the right time to disclose bipolar disorder to a romantic partner? I know a questioner says, I know it depends on the situation, but please give me some ideas. At what point in the relationship or dating process? And then they also add that they're taking medications which may impact their ability or decisions around childbearing. And so that's an issue, an extra layer here too.
I'd say for that one, go with, I know we're saying whatever you feel the most comfortable with, but generally I'd say my strategy has been like go on a few dates actually to like so that way they see you as you, and then when it actually comes up and a comfortable, like there's a natural transition to actually discuss it. So I'm talking about research I'm working on. That's a smooth transition to discuss it. That can be an appropriate time. I know I sympathize with that because there's a trade-off. You want to actually filter out the people that aren't going to be accepting and get rid of them as soon as possible. On the flip side, you don't want to actually do it too soon because then people are going to be like, whoa, this is the first date. This is coffee. We're just trying to find out like general questions like, do you go surfing? Do you have siblings? But I'm not saying this tactic works for everyone, but I think giving the chance for the person to see you as you and recognize that, look, it's not the defining thing about you. It's an aspect of you, but it's not the only part of you, can be really useful. And then as a result, when they actually hear it's not just because if it's really early on, say first date, you risk that becomes the way that they view you. You're a bipolar person. But if they see you as more of a three-dimensional person, then it's just an additional characteristic of you. So I the exact number of dates I don't really know. But I know it can be challenging, but I think thinking positively, the people who do judge, what I've tried to keep in mind, it can be hurtful at times, but at least knowing, okay, that person's obviously not the right match. If they do actually respond really negatively, can be a useful thing to keep in mind. Although it's easier said than done because it can actually be hurtful in the moment.
Well, I'll actually speak to that from a personal more than a clinician perspective that I live with an anxiety disorder, and it definitely impacts my romantic relationships. And it's nuanced, like Brad was saying, but it's almost as if, do you get to the point where you're like, it seems worthwhile to share this with the person because I like where this is going. I like them. I've dated people where I'm like, yeah, no, they're not worth it. But then if you really feel you have a connection and you're starting to develop a sense of trust and, it feels like the right time, it is hard to determine exactly when that is. It really depends on the people involved in the relationship. But generally, I would say of like, this feels like something I'm really interested in. I'd like this to move forward. I think this would really make sense at this time to share.
The one additional thing I'll add that I think can happen with dating also is because like you're also trying to weed out the people that won't accept you for you. It can also be as far as trying to get a sense for how you actually want to go about disclosing, like what tactics you want to actually use to avoid disclosing. It can be a useful context to practice those, like particularly if the person you're dating doesn't have like as close a connection to your professional personal life, because there it's kind of like, I mean, I'm a social psychologist, but I kind of view it as I'm pilot testing this. I'm giving it a go, like trying how this works. And then if it doesn't work out, I've learned something. I don't do that approach again. And then, and it can help to get more confidence with the process of talking about it before you go to say like a more higher stakes place. Not to say that dating isn't high stakes, but it's like before you say talk about it in a professional context, because it can be really anxiety provoking to talk about it. So it can be a chance to pilot test strategies, for lack of a better term.
Oh, Brad, you're hilarious. You are the ultimate social psychologist if you're using your dating relationships as a testing ground, essentially.
I don't say that in the dates, but yeah.
Oh, no. So to clarify, you're not testing in the actual date itself.
Oh, no, I mean, in a way, yes, right? Because I mean, but I don't say that. As we said, we don't disclose everything. I wouldn't say like, oh, I'm viewing this as a pilot test with a sample size of 1, and we'll see how this actually plays out. At least not on the first date.
Thanks for clarifying. I know you have experience of this, Brad, and you too, Lisa, in terms of, your extensive work as a teacher. What about the context of education systems? Thinking about disclosure in undergraduate school, in grad school. Question that came in specifically on this is, would you disclose your diagnosis on a university application? And what about situations where the field that you're applying to is a mental health field? Is there an asset of disclosing, or is discrimination just as prevalent? Any thoughts on that?
I'm happy to jump in here. So as a teacher, I would say, I work in social work, and actually research suggests that a lot of students that go into social work is actually a higher prevalence of mental health conditions than the general population. So I do have a lot of students who disclose mental health conditions, learning disabilities, other types. And one challenges that I face is when I don't know, and also, especially now with virtual teaching, online, we're not interacting as much, the teacher and the student. And so you're not really developing the same type of relationship and getting to know them. And so when issues do come up, such as a lot of absences or, lower quality of work, because something's going on, that I'm just basing it on like I would grade everybody else. And it does result in a lower grade. And then sometimes I'll have people come to me afterwards saying, oh, I should have shared this before. And then it becomes, a discussion about what to do after the fact. And so the bottom line is, I would say my sense is, at least at my university, that it seems to be pretty well established. There's usually a disabilities office. You can go to them. They're quite confidential. Even when I talk to them regarding my students, they're not sharing information. They're guiding me, giving me suggestions of what would be appropriate accommodations for them. And of course, I can't speak to the teacher themselves and what kind of biases they may hold or any discrimination. But I will say that it's pretty highly regulated in a lot of universities at this point. So I would say that, speaking from my experience.
I'd say my experience has been consistent, and from the professor's perspective, it can be useful just because you get a lot of excuses and it's hard to weed through. Okay, like, you want to be consistent across all the evaluations, and then you can get wild excuses. So like knowing which one's actually valid, which one's not, can be really tough. But then, just having the disabilities office just send you an email just saying, hey, this person needs extra time. I don't think even people spend like any time even attending to what the underlying cause is. They just see, oh, this person needs 50% extra time. Okay, we'll set that up. So it can help to, if you do need an accommodation, it just makes it a lot easier and can make it easier for the professor to set that up and actually help avoid situations where, like, after the fact, like where it's tougher for the professor to sort through, like, is this person actually going through something? Are they not?
Thoughtful answers, both of you. Thank you. One more question on accommodations. So this is from somebody on the line who is saying that when they're in an episode laced with some psychosis, the symptoms of the psychosis they have make it impossible to phone into work to ask for a shift off. They've asked for an accommodation around a friend or a family member doing that, but their employer is intractable on that. And this is similar to a question we had come in on World Bipolar Day, which was from somebody who was requesting not to do 2 on, 2 off work shifts. If there's one thing that you can do that's bad for your body clock as a shift worker, is to do, a very regular shift that we see, 2 days, 2 nights, especially if you live with bipolar disorder. Their request for an accommodation was, legal, but it was again met with resistance by their manager. Any tips from either of you on working through those roadblocks when you've disclosed to an employer, asked for an accommodation, but then hit a wall?
I have to clear. I have a few things going on in my mind. So the first thing is, it's the unfortunate situation, and it really is frustrating to hear stories when people are legally obligated to these work accommodations, and then the employer does not request them. So one thing that's important under, like, for example, the American Disabilities Act, and I know that I'm pretty sure this is present in Canada and Australia and other countries, that it says appropriate work accommodations based on the type of employment that you're doing. So there is some discretion there by the employer to determine whether it is appropriate or not. Now, one thing that I know has been helpful for people is having actual letters written by a psychiatrist. If your company has, if it's an organization large enough where they have a human resources department or an employee assistant program, these are individuals trained in this. This is part of what they do. And so you can sometimes get support from them to also contact your supervisor, your boss, saying, this is, an appropriate accommodation. This is something that's very fitting for this individual, and we support it. So having that kind of support can help remind the person that this is my legal right to be requesting this, and it seems appropriate for my job.
So this is probably just more from a general negotiations perspective than necessarily bipolar. I try to talk to them one-on-one and try to actually understand what their reasoning is for the policy. And then also to explain to them, and you might, depending on the circumstances, you may or may not want to even disclose all the details of your condition. And if you can actually try to understand their concerns and then also highlight why actually having whatever flexibility is will help you to actually be a more productive employee and actually will help the organization more. That talking to them one-on-one, it's harder for people to just shoot you down if they're talking to you face-to-face, can potentially lead to a better outcome. It's not always the case, obviously. Sometimes you can get really unreasonable people. There might be a policy they're unwilling to budge, but and the chance that there actually is more flexibility, trying to talk to them one-on-one and understand why are they actually being inflexible on it, and then highlighting to them that it would be really useful for you, and you can choose how much you want to disclose and why it would actually be in their best interest to actually give you greater flexibility. Can in a lot of situations at least help to hopefully lead to a better outcome.
Thanks, Brad. It's a canny response. Let's have a look at some of the resources that we said that we would share, and then we'll come back to our two panelists for final thoughts after that very rich discussion. You can find links for everything we talked about, including the strategies that Brad talked about in detail at our website, TalkBD Live. It was complex to describe, but please know that, as you can see, there are key points laid out in that document for you to reference back to. You can find episodes of all of our prior TalkBD events at our TalkBD website. Thank you, Lisa and Brad, too, for those really thoughtful, detailed, often complicated and nuanced responses to a topic that's often nuanced and complicated. I appreciate that there are no easy or cookie cutter answers in this space. I wondered if you wanted to share any final reflections, having spent an hour together talking about disclosure and bipolar disorder.
The only thing I would add, and I know we've touched on this, but first of all, thank you for having me here. I really enjoyed this, and I hope this was helpful. I wish we could have gotten to more of the questions in the chat. Really appreciated the comments and questions there. My thought is related to what Brad was saying earlier, and that, you can anticipate and prepare as much as you want when you're disclosing, and you never really know how the person's going to respond, of course. And people can be surprising in terms of questions they'll ask, follow-up questions, information that might feel very personal. And it can be helpful, like with the strategies Brad provided, to think about even certain statements you might have readily available, such as whether you're comfortable answering it, or, it's a great question. Let me think about that. Maybe get back to you to deflect it. But don't ever feel obligated to share more than you're comfortable sharing. People can be, like I said, very surprising in that way. So I just wanted to add that. This is your life, your personal information, and it's important to protect yourself and do what you think is best for you.
Yeah, and just wanted to thank everyone for actually having me. Thank you all for for the super thoughtful questions. Sorry that we couldn't get to more, but really appreciate all of you actually sharing. And for your input on this topic. It's extremely helpful. I'd say for a final thought, I think so. Again, it's a high risk, high reward behavior disclosure, but I think, and it's really hard to anticipate in advance how people will respond. But at least from personal experience, I've seen there's been cases I've been actually highly disappointed. But then there's also been a lot of cases where people are like blissfully indifferent, where they're just like, okay, that's an additional piece of information about you. And then also even cases where people are tremendously supportive. So it's, as we were talking about before, it's really easy to attend to the negative, but there can also be some very positive experiences that come through it. And I hope you all actually experience more positive than negative. So thank you for having me. And I'm really happy to have been here. Thank you.
Thank you, Brad. Thank you, Lisa. Until next time.
Bye.